Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. Welcome to the IAPB Learn Human Tissue and You webinar. My name is Emma Foote from IAPB, and I will be chairing this webinar today. This is the third in a series of IAPB Learn webinars, with more to come in the new year. The IAPB have been setting up to encourage members to learn and connect on a range of eye health issues. Thank you to you all for attending today and being very patient. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us and be part of our learning community. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to hand over to Heather. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you so much. Can you see my screen? Oh, here we go. Show my screen. There we go. We're in. So hello, thank you everybody, and thank you for joining me today for this presentation on human tissue, you and the eye. So my name is Heather Machin and I do live in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm glad to do this today for the IAPB. And I'd also like to thank Emma and the IAPB for their leadership in considering this subject for one of their webinars. So this presentation, it's not going to be complex or very scientific or with lots of epidemiological discussions or even clinical or disease specific. It's actually designed to help set the scene and entice you as an IAPB member or a non-IAPB member to consider engaging further in this field of inquiry. And I hope it does raise your interest. And I hope after the session, you will provide Emma with some recommendations for further webinars or even conference or congress topics, because there are plenty of people in the iBank community who I'm sure would love to be engaged and help build this area of interest. So there are lots of global differences, I just need to point that out, but today I'm just going to stick to some very general areas. So I will start with a quick review of human biologicals before we then move on to some of the challenges and then how we're tracking those as a sector or how we're dealing with those challenges. And I'm going to flip between talking about you as an eye tissue custodian or you as an eye care professional to you as a potential donor, and also you as somebody who may have to look after your loved one at their end of their life and follow their wishes for them. So a few different areas there. In the spirit of full disclosure, I am involved in several IAPB members, being the Global Alliance of iBank Associations, Centre for Eye Research Australia, and the Fred Hollows Foundation in New Zealand. And I do have a grant with the Australian Commonwealth Government at the moment. But my session today doesn't necessarily reflect the views of those organisations nor the IAPB. So when we think about human tissue, I'm pretty sure you're thinking corneal transplantation and eye banking. And well, that's correct, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that doesn't actually do justice to this sector. There is so much going on in this sector, and there's so much that these eye bankers and these custodians are involved in. So sure, corneal transplantations are the main reason. But you may not know this, but we also take the white of the eye, that's the sclera, and we use that in glaucoma surgery. Or sometimes we use the cornea for surface burns as well. Tissue for training is also really important. So that's not just to help up and coming or the next generation surgeons, but that's also to support our eye bankers and our existing surgeons with their tissue preparation techniques. And finally, of course, there's research. And this is actually a growth area, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. And this is becoming especially or increasingly more relevant as the sector, not just in cornea, but in other areas of eye care and general health, are interested in finding alternative therapies or examining things such as cell engineering. So when you are both alive or you are dead, you can actually become a donor. So we're going to focus on death today, which is cadaveric donation. But just for your reference, you can become a donor right now. And you can donate things like blood or reproductive materials, sperms and eggs, or even a kidney. So death is inevitable, and we're all going to die. And while we may decide that we would like to become a donor, that might not actually be the case. See, it depends on how we die and where we die, and that determines whether we can be an acceptable donor or not. So think of it this way: you may want to donate your body for transplantation, but you might not be eligible due to the reason why you died. So what happens then is that most people who want to be a donor end up being eye-only donors because there's less risk with the eye and there's less matching requirements like there are with kidneys and those sorts of things. So eye-only donors tend to be the most donors in the world. Now, of course, in many parts of the world, there are no donation or eye banking systems in place. So in those locations, you won't have the opportunity to become a donor. However, there are places where you can become a donor, and there are 3 different options as to how you can become a donor. In your country, you might have what's called an opt-in system, and this means you have to have demonstrated during your life that you wanted to become a donor. The other way is opt-out, whereby your government has already determined that you're going to be a donor, unless you demonstrated objection during your life to opt out. Now, there's a third type, which is quite rare, and most people don't know about this one, but it's called opt-in with incentive, whereby if you place yourself on the donation register, but then you actually need tissue or an organ yourself, you'll actually be prioritized to receive those donations because you showed a willingness to give to others by putting yourself on the register. So that's all very interesting. Now, all major religions support donation of some kind or another, though there are exceptions, an obvious one being Jehovah's Witness when it comes to blood. So most objections, they tend to be culture-based rather than actually the religion. So death, we don't talk about it enough, but perhaps we should. Now, when I die, I'd like to spend my last moments on a beach listening to the waves, or in the mountains listening to birds, or being accompanied by my loved ones. But sadly, the reality is that I, like 80% of us, or at least those of us in the West, we're actually going to die in a hospital or a healthcare facility. And while that's not actually desirable for me on a personal level, in terms of becoming a donor, there is a greater chance of me becoming a donor if I die in a hospital or my body is transferred to a hospital. And this is purely for logistic and practical reasons. So around the world in hospitals, there are actually trained staff, or in most hospitals. Sometimes these are called counsellors or donor coordinators, and generally they come with a background in nursing or experience in intensive care, critical care, end-of-life care, or even grief counselling. They can be trained grief counsellors. And what these trained staff do is they liaise between the hospital staff, the donor or the donor's family, and also the eye bank to make sure that that donation, education, and consent process takes place. Depending on the country or the setup, they may also complete a review of the medical, surgical, and social history prior to confirming the donation and arranging for the recovery of that tissue. Now, once it's established that somebody is going to become a donor and the consent has been completed, those coordinators or a technician will cover the donation. So for eyes, they may just cover what's called the corneoscleral rim, just like that very first photo there on the left-hand side where you can see the cornea being removed. So that's the corneoscleral rim. However, others may cover the whole globe, and that actually depends on the eye bank practice and or if the globe is consented and requested for training and research. The donation is then transferred to the eye bank for preparation. And of course, for transplants, it can be prepared or pre-cut, and it can be preserved in several different ways. Now, without going too deep, the sector has multiple layers or multiple stakeholders involved, and these depend on the country or the resource level or the experience and exposure to human biologicals of that particular country or jurisdiction. But preferably or ideally, an eye bank, if they're the custodians or the main custodians, they'll be governed by a regulatory body, and they'll participate in national donation or reporting systems. Ideally, they'll also have a Tissue Act, they'll have a good code of manufacturing practices in place, and even medical standards. They'll also have agreements with hospitals, the mortuaries, the coronial offices regarding permission to enter their facilities to recover those consented donors. And they can also liaise with other external groups such as a pathology laboratory, because they need them to help them do the blood samples, and that will help prevent risk to the recipient. They may also liaise with other organ and tissue groups, because even though we may consider them as part of the eye care sector, they also have a very, very large role to play in the human biological sector. And they're actually a large part of that particular health service. Now, I don't know your backgrounds, but you may or may not consider yourself a custodian, but to me you are. All of us are custodians of the donation process. You may also use the term steward. So we all have a duty of care, and we all have an opportunity and a role to play in respecting the wishes of the donor during their decision process, at that point of death, during the donation recovery and allocation process, and also all the way up to the time it's transplanted. And this is to ensure the donation is maximised for the betterment of all and in memory of that gift of donation. So even if you are involved in the logistics, or you are a capacity development group involved in the IAPB, and you're asking for tissue, you have a responsibility to make sure that tissue is cared for and handled to prevent waste and things like that. So we don't want it to expire or be thrown in the bin. We want to make sure that donation makes its journey to the recipient and so on. So before I go on to talk about the main body of this presentation, I want to say that the majority of people involved in this sector are doing the right thing. They go to work and they do their best to ensure they are supporting the donor and the recipients as best they can within the system, the organisation, or the country that they work in. Now, I'm an ophthalmic operating theatre nurse, and for the last 5 years, I've been privileged to be allowed to see inside the eye banking sector, and I am continually amazed by what I see and the people that I work with. I've found some of the most compassionate and supportive eye healthcare professionals and support service people working in the sector. So what I'm going to focus on the next few slides, I want you to consider it as housekeeping or behind the scenes issues, if you will, because every sector has them. And these are things that we need to smooth out and harmonise in our own sector or as a community. And that's called a humanitarian approach. And I hope you'll join us with that. So the first challenge is we don't know what's really going on. So the sector has had a great deal of success in terms of its day-to-day service and provision, but it's not really until 2015 when a French group led by Philippe Gain published some information about the actual stats of what's actually going on. And they used volunteer data based on a 2012 survey to gain that snapshot. They estimated there was about 12.7 million blind persons who could benefit from a corneal transplant. They also estimated about 53% of those lived without routine access, with a majority of those being in low to middle income countries. Now, interestingly, this tells me that while we've been focusing on the services, we may not actually stood back and reflected on what we're doing regionally or globally and how we can support each other a little bit more. So that's something that we need to challenge and see how we can work towards that in the future. Supply and demand. So corneal tissue is actually one of the oldest transplant types. And in fact, the first successful human-to-human corneal transplant was recorded in 1905 by a gentleman called Zerm in Europe. And the first dedicated eye bank, or what we consider an eye bank today, followed in 1941 in New York. Now that eye bank remains today, and there's around 700 eye banks all over the world, though that number changes continuously. So since that time, the sector has expanded, but primarily so in high resource locations. And this has developed vast differences between what I call the haves and the have-nots, with some countries in oversupply of corneal tissue and others without any. And this inequity, it's inadvertently created a marketplace and contributed to what we call bioeconomies, where competitive business practices and corneal tissue cost variations ensue. And this all becomes very confusing and very complicated, even for those in the sector, no matter which side of the receiving or providing you stand. Ultimately, this confusion erodes this beautiful gift of donation. And ultimately, it erodes the sector's ability to work harmoniously as a transparent and open community. Now, referral systems also have a large role to play in these disparities as well. I mentioned earlier about the likelihood of you becoming a donor if you're in a if you pass away in a hospital. So these are called hospital retrieval programs, or in our instance, hospital corneal retrieval programs. And by having those programs inside a hospital, they offer people the opportunity to become a donor. Automated death notification systems also aid in increasing the opportunity of offering donation to the wider members of the community. And that's not necessarily everywhere either. So referrals or donations or public education, if you will, and those setting up of those referral pathways, they remain the most important aspect of any human tissue and donation program. Now, finally, human tissue tends not to be included in our eye health plans either. And, well, perhaps they should. I'm not sure about all the eye banks, but it happens quite a lot that I'm actually approached by individuals in international development, both formal NGOs and just informal individuals who ask for tissue. And while I do see this in a positive light, because it tells me that there is interest in helping provide transplantation to those in need, and that's something we want to encourage, as somebody working in the sector, I also have reservations because I don't just want to give tissue to anybody. See, in the eye banking sector, our job is to make sure that that donation is maximised. And we have a duty to the donor to make sure that their donation is provided and used in the best way possible. So for us to give to a humanitarian group, we want to make sure a couple of things are in place. For example, we want to make sure that there are physicians trained that know how to use the tissue, and specifically after an expatriate team leaves, because those working in the sector know that the first 12 months post-operatively are when grafts can fail or infections can occur, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen, particularly as a risk for the recipient. Now, it's also quite common that I'm contacted from good intended people who want to build eye banks. And again, this shows great interest and we want to encourage that. But often the bricks and mortar of the bank aren't actually the issue. The real work in building an eye bank comes from working and educating the public on their donation options. And this takes years and it requires a long-term commitment. So remember, without donors, there are no eye banks. Now, bioethics is a little bit of a curly area. So let me start by just explaining two differences between morals and ethics. So morals are what I believe. Ethics are what we believe as a society, as a sector, or as a community. And so these ethics become our norms. So in bioethics, this refers to our society or our community's human biological norms. Now, bioethics is its own area of specialisation, and I'm only going to touch on this briefly as a layman because it's quite a complex area. And if you do want to find out a little bit more about this, put that in the post survey, and if we need to get a bioethicist to come in and explain this much better than I can, we can certainly do that. But some of the areas of concern regarding ethics mainly are to do with equitable recovery and allocation of that voluntary gift or donation, and retaining that of the society's and the community's norms. They're also interested in retaining the donation as a public resource for the shared benefit of all. And again, that's about maximising that donation. So some of the areas that they refer to actually start with how we reference or treat the donation. Often, and I've been guilty of this as well, of referring to the donation as material or a body part, a part or a product. And what this does, it actually devalues the donation, and it suggests that the donation is just an item. And unfortunately, that can also lead to what's called commercialization or commoditization. Or in other words, we start to objectify or turn this beautiful donation into an object or an item that can be traded as a commodity. And again, this devalues that concept of the gift. Other contentious issues relate to profitisation and the steps to and how profit is derived and determined. This relates to profits from both not-for-profits and those involved in for-profit transfers and business. So basically, Tissue Acts stipulate that cost recovery, and by cost recovery, I want you to think staffing, electricity, logistics, that they're the only costs that can be derived. Anything above that is considered profit. Now, there are far more complex issues and terms, such as attenuation, where costs can be recovered through work skill rules when developments have changed the donation into something else, and issues such as partnering or binding the donation with a man-made medical device, such as an injector, whereby if you want that injector, you must use that company's tissue, and vice versa. So these are quite complex issues, so I'm going to leave it there, but I hope if that's something that's of interest to you, we can look at bringing that into an IAPB event at a later date. Business models also pose some challenges, and you may consider or assume that the model goes straight from the donation to the iBank, where it's recovered and processed and distributed by a not-for-profit organisation and then transferred for use. In fact, it's a little bit more complex than that. And some providers in some countries have chosen to implement various patchwork or rather complex models where, for instance, they have split their business model to allow, after the recovery of the donation to their organisation, its transfer to their for-profit arm. Others may use external or affiliated distributors, and some may also have venture capitalists or shareholders who they serve. Now, you may consider this new or different way of doing things, but it's not necessarily so. In fact, similar models have existed in blood, tissue, and the reproductive sector for some time. Though interestingly, there is no evidence that these models have impacted or helped meet the needs of those sectors. So the debate centres around whether these complex models are legal or not. Well, the truth is it's both. See, in the countries these are set up in, their laws just say you need to be a not-for-profit to recover tissue, and it kind of leaves it at that. Now, depending on where you come from or your interpretation of that law, you may perceive no mention of for-profit as a permission to do so. And this depends a lot on your culture and your business modelling in terms of whether you come from a neoclassical or neoliberal post-Fordism approach to business or not. And while they do believe, or those involved do believe, that this interpretation of the law allows them that right to transfer or trade or profit from the death of a loved one, there are others that do not. So those that do not feel that the altruistic voluntary donation is one for the shared benefit of all and not for the control of a few or for profit. They also believe profitization skews need or agenda or erodes the trust in the sector by donors. So this legal lacuna, or these legal gaps, if you will, they will remain for some time because this is based in common law, and reform, it's necessary, but we know it's going to take some time. So instead, we rely on soft tools, such as working with our societies to engage and develop frameworks, guidelines, and work as a community to address some of these complicated areas of service. Now, apart from the business or the legal side, these complex models, or should I say, the more the donation is moved or transferred from one group to another, means the supply chain or the movement of the tissue also becomes more complex. And that's when we get a little bit more ethical and practical tracking concerns that come into play as well. So there's quite a few things that we're working on as the sector. So we're working to harmonise things and help retain that humanitarian nature and ensure that the donation is respected as we work through some of these changes. So last month, the WHO established a new task force looking at donations for transplantation. We're still awaiting the outcomes for that report, but we're pleased to inform you that there's both an eye banker and ophthalmologist represented on that task force. Secondly, one of the ways that we're looking at harmonising the sector and working through these issues is through the Global Alliance of IBank Associations, which was established in 2014 as a direct recommendation of the WHO to commence tackling or addressing some of these wider issues. You may or may not know that in June this year, the sector also launched the Barcelona Principles, which is an agreement on the use of human-donated tissue for ocular transplantation, research and future technologies. And this was developed with comment, support, dialogue and design from over 102 people from 83 countries. It was done so in conjunction with the IAPB, the International Council of Ophthalmology, the Corneal Society, and other eye bank associations and ophthalmological societies around the world. And you may not know this, but this is actually one of the few global bioethical frameworks for any tissue type. And to me, that speaks volume about the compassion and the support of all members of our custodian group and all the stakeholders involved in this sector. There's definitely care and support here. If you do have a chance to look at this document, I also want to draw your attention to the appendix section. Often we forget to read the appendix, but it has some really good information about important export practices. Something else we're looking at doing is developing global medical standards. Still in its early stages, but we're hoping to have those out in 2019, so stay tuned. Tracking is also really important, and this is particularly so as we're starting to see an increase or more movement of tissue, and particularly with different groups sending it to different people within their business models. So the sector has implemented something that's called the ISBT 128 tracking system. This was actually developed for bloods, but it has a great deal of use in tissues as well. And it uses globally agreed nomenclature and labeling systems. So you can move tissue from Venice to Vientiane and you'll still be able to track the tissue. It does require some setup costs, just for those interested in setting it up, but it does provide that global tracking ability. Other conversations have started around transnational activities, particularly regarding supply chain lines, because we want to see how we can improve how we're working, how we're coordinating, and how we're interacting with each other to make sure we're getting tissue from the haves to the have-nots, but retaining those ethical and respectful boundaries. Data is also something that we're working on. And again, I'd like to congratulate Gain et al. For their 2015 paper where they started to look at data and tracking. So we as a sector are looking to build upon that data by collecting data routinely. This is going to take some time because we've never done this as a global community, but we hope to start doing it next year and doing it as a community. And I'm pleased to report that we do have many iBankers and in fact many IAPB iBank members who are willing to help promote forward those messages. And I'd like to thank them in advance, and I look forward to starting this project with you long term. The main point of doing this data project is so that you or anybody or a student can actually go and have a look at de-identified data of a particular region or a country to see what's going on. Outcome registries are also something that the sector is working on. So outcome registries provide long-term multivariate analysis of the eye banks and the surgeons separately and together. And it provides them both with the opportunity to reflect on their services, their methods and their techniques and look at how those can change. So Australia has the oldest one. It's been going for over 30 years. The EU have commenced a registry and they actually invite non-European people to be involved. So if you're not from Europe and you'd like to find out about registry or how you can participate, follow that website there. And the USA are also in early conversations about developing their own outcome registry. We also use the sector to share very important messages, mostly medical alerts, and this is basically to prevent risk. So that can be from a local, a national or a global point of view, and we disseminate that as far and wide as possible. We also communicate with other tissues and other organs as well to make sure all those messages are coming back and forth. There are also registries, for instance, there's a little logo there for Project notify. So this is developed by the WHO with I think it's the Italian Transplant Society. And so if there's an infection outbreak with tissue in one part of the world, it can be uploaded to this website, and those who have login rights can actually go in and see that and track those issues. So we want to make sure that this message sharing is available because we want to prevent risk to the recipient. As I mentioned, research is also a growth area, and I think you're going to see more and more conversation about research tissue coming up as we move forward. And this is in terms of quantity and also how we manage or treat donations. And as such, the Global Alliance actually included research tissue as the final principle in the Barcelona Principles because this is very much an area of need. And each country is actually examining, or region, is actually examining how they can improve access to research tissue, but retaining that ethical and respectful treatment of the donor. And in fact, the USA's iBank Association of America and the Association for Research in Vision and Ophthalmology, they're actually working together to see how they can create a portal to help manage those requests. And other countries are also having a look at how they can do it as well. Now, almost finished. So finally, of course, collaboration is really important. And I just paste this particular example here because it shows the feedback loop. When we're collaborating with ophthalmologists, the corneal sector and the eye bank sector all together in creating opportunities, that feedback loop improves. And we're able to make sure that we're moving collectively as a sector. I do recommend you have a look at this particular document. It does provide some great starting information on some of the recommendations if you do want to get involved or start your own iBank or participate or connect with those involved. Now, how do you request tissue? So we don't just give tissue to anyone. It must be requested by a surgeon involved in corneal surgery or glaucoma if it's a sclera, or the hospital on their behalf. Or of course, if you're a researcher, you must demonstrate that you have research ethics approval from a formal institution. So if you want tissue, you need to start by asking your local iBank. Now, if you don't have a local iBank, you can ask your national iBank. And if you don't have a national iBank, then you can ask the association. So under I don't know whether you'll see my mouse here. So if you click on this Global Alliance link here, it'll take you to all the different regional associations. And if you click on those regional associations, you can then see who the iBanks are in their region. And there are over 700 iBanks, so hopefully you'll be able to find one. But of course, there are regions without iBanks. So you may want to call some of the ones involved in international development. Now, as an FYI, I've also listed some of the IAPB members or current members that I know are engaged in iBanking or provision of some sort of corneal surgery service or support. Now, this isn't an endorsement, and I'm not saying those on the list should be used compared to those who are not on the list or vice versa. I'm merely bringing them to your attention. And you may also find them on the IAP members map. But of course, some of them who work internationally in more than one country might not be able to put a pin on every country. So find out where the headquarters are for those organisations and then follow those up as you need. Now, remember, anybody that you're working with, it's your responsibility to do your due diligence and make sure that those organisations are meeting sectorial requirements and expectations, and of course, your expectations as well. So finally, some resources. There are quite a few different general resources on this page, so you don't have to remember where they all are. If you actually just go to the IAPB page, Corneal Issues and Surgery, most of them are already linked in there anyway, so you can just click straight into there. So again, this is all very generalist, but I hope it will kickstart some interest. Now, if you're in a country or region where you don't have a Donate Life Week or an Eye Donation Month, the US Eye Bank Association are willing to help share their Donate Life Month with anybody who's interested, and they do that in November. And they have a toolkit there as well. And of course, we'd love to promote donation. So if you'd like to have a look at that Eye Donation Month, that would be great as well. So that brings me to the end of this presentation, or this introduction to iBanking and our utility and need for human tissue. So before I sign off, there's a couple of really important messages that I want you to take home with you. The first one is I want you to go home and tell your loved ones whether or not you want to become a donor, because we never know when we're going to die. You could die in 10 years' time, you could die tomorrow. But have that conversation now, just in case, and ask them what they want to do so that when they pass away, you can also fulfill their wishes as well. That's possibly the most important message I can ever give you. But of course, my second message is I would love you to help be involved in promoting forward amongst your organisations the need for donation and maintaining that respect for the donor while we simultaneously work towards helping those with vision impairment. So thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Emma.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was an incredibly comprehensive overview, not just from the donor's perspective, but the iBanking industry, their business models. It was fantastic. So thank you very much. We have had some questions coming in, but please do. We've got probably about 15 to 20 minutes of questions we can ask Heather. So if there is a burning question that you have for her, please do ask. Heather, I suppose the first question is, can we share your presentation with our audience, or parts of your present? Have you got some pages we can share with people afterwards?
I could, yes. And of course, my email address is right there. If you have a particular thing, I can write it down and send it to you. I will do my best, certainly.
Thank you very much. So the next question I have for you, Heather, is if an IAPB member is looking at or considering supporting corneal services in low to middle income countries, what do they need to consider with regards to human tissue needs?
That's a fantastic question, and I'd be pleased if people are looking at doing that. So the first thing you need to look at is both the long-term requirements and also the short-term requirements. So your desire might be to build an eye bank, but you need to actually see whether that's necessary in that population size. You also need to see whether the ophthalmologist or the health system supports that as well. Just willy-nilly opening an eye bank is probably not a good idea. A lot of the members who are IAPB members are involved in international development. They already have a lot of tools available to help assist you, so you may want to start there as well. But the short term, you also need to look at your import laws and then how you're going to get tissue and those sorts of things. But the most important, as I said previously, and I hope this has been quite a take-home message, is without donors, there is no eye bank. So while you might want to build eye bank services or care for corneal patients in your region, the long-term goal is to look at eye donation. That conversation at the community level, at the local community events, the churches, the schools, the marketplaces, that's where the heart of the eye banking comes into play, but that takes a long time.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for that. Another question's just come in from someone saying, what can IAPB members do to support you and others working in this field?
Wow. Well, I can have a big shopping list for you, but I think the most important thing that you could do for the community or the sector is help promote the gift of donation and inform people that they have the opportunity to donate different parts of their, I'm going to use it, different parts of their body, and they can donate for research, transplant, and also training. And the more we provide people with that information at that point of death, they're more likely to have had a decision already made, and that donation and consent process would be much, much easier for them. So that's the most important thing that we would like people to do. And of course, if you are interested in getting further involved with perhaps some of the partners that we've listed or shared with you today, take the time to have a look at things like the Barcelona Principles or the International Council of Ophthalmology statement, just so you know a little bit about what's happening and the sort of things that you need to do yourself as well.
Thank you, Heather. We've got a question as well come in from Mahmood, who asks, is the international community at all looking at using animal corneas, for example? He says that they have issues with scarring resulting from trachoma is an issue for them.
Well, the Global Alliance of Eye Bank Associations only looks at human donations. So this presentation is only looking at humans. And there are some people, particularly I think in Korea, who are looking at animal models and China as well, but they haven't really taken up most of the sector and most of the research and most of the focus is on human donations. And I'm going to, I should have got the stat, but the fact is that there are plenty of people dying around the world. So we really shouldn't have to look at animal models. So it's not necessarily about looking at animal models, it's about using our existing services a little bit better and seeing how we can take those models from one area to another or from the haves to the have-nots. So we don't necessarily need to look at animal models.
Thank you, Heather, and I hope that answers your question, Mahmood. We've got another question saying from Matt, is there an international ethical code which people, organisations, donor banks can sign up to ensure ethical use of donations?
From our sector, it's the Barcelona Principles, but there are others. So, for example, if you work in the organ sector, it's the Declaration of Istanbul on Organ Trafficking and Transplant Tourism. And let me just, there's also the Declaration of Helsinki if you're involved in research. And then there's also, I think, the World Research Institute. Let me just find the name for it on my trusty little prepared documents here. And that is the Council for International Organizations for Medical Scientists International Ethical Guidelines for Health-Related Research Involving Human Tissues, and that's a 2016 document developed by the World Medical Association, who also developed the Declaration of Helsinki. So there are quite a lot of different ethical guidelines, and of course the WHO also have some recommendations as well, particularly number 6322, and that's also linked on the IAPB donor cornea information page. That document's there as well.
Excellent, thank you. I think that's all our questions at the moment, and our audience say thank you very much, Heather, for answering those questions. So I think we will wrap up. So I'd just like to end by thanking our presenter, Heather. Thank you so much for your comprehensive presentation and responses to all of our questions. And thank you to everyone who's participated. We really appreciate you taking the time to be part of our IAPB Learn community. You will now receive a short survey from me directly, and hopefully we can share some parts of Heather's presentation with you as well. And please do just take 5 minutes to complete it. Your support for these webinars really makes them possible, and your feedback helps us to improve them. So thanks again for everybody, and look out for more future IAPB Learn webinars. And if you are interested in hosting any, please do contact me. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you very much, Emma, and good evening, everybody, or good morning.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.